So this first class, this first session, what I want to talk to you about is the broad overview of wealth and possessions. So the first thing that I find when it comes to topics of finances, and I hear this often in the churches, I hear pastors, my own pastor will make this claim, something like, the Bible talks more about money and hell than any other topic. And yet these are two topics that we tend to avoid in the church. And while I appreciate the spirit of what my pastor's saying, neither one of those statements are actually true. First of all, most of the time in the Old Testament, when it talks about Sheol, Sheol is not hell. That's where you go when you die. It's a different place than hell, but that's a different issue. But secondly, the Bible actually doesn't talk about money very much. The Bible really isn't concerned about money per se, because the idea of money is too small and it's too modern of an idea. We need to realize that this is a book that was written before the time where we have an economy that is based on money, that this is an economy that deals with things like bartering and trade. There's money in the Bible, but money isn't the most important thing in the Bible. Instead, the Bible is going to have a broader picture beyond money to talk about wealth and possessions. And I think this is really key for us, that we need to get into a cultural shift in terms of what the ancient world looked like and what the Bible is actually talking about when it comes to money. And if we can get a broader view of what the Bible talks about with money, I think this is important because it helps us in modern times to have a broader view of what God's talking about when it comes to our wealth and possessions. And so I work with undergraduate college students, and so often they complain about being poor. I also work with graduate students, and I was a graduate student once, and I was poor. My first job when I was at Fuller Seminary, I was going to school in seminary, and my youth pastor gig, I made all of $10,000 a year as a youth pastor, and I lived here in Southern California. And thankfully, God helped provide an apartment where I was only paying $250 a month in rent in kind of this slum apartment. Wasn't the nicest place as well, but God made that $10,000 stretch incredibly, but I had to use that $10,000 to live on and pay for school, and there were choices that I made that probably weren't the wisest choices, so letting things like health insurance not be a high priority during that time of my life. So I get it. I get what it's like to be feeling poor. And yet, that when I think about the history of my life, that's a unique time of my life. And I think when we go to college, we're not going to college so that we stay poor. We're going to college so that we can make more money and get jobs. But what happens is that when it comes to things like tithes and offerings, is that we can get into the sense that we're so impoverished that we couldn't possibly use any of that extra money to give to God, because we need all of that money just to survive on. And I think when we start to talk about wealth and possessions in terms of a broader category, that we discover that even though we have times like where we may not have the financial resources that we would like to be generous, that we have other resources. So what about the cars we have? What about the houses we have or apartments we have? What are the things that are like the computers we have? Can we be sharing the possessions that God has given us? And I think it can be the time that we have. And so by thinking more broadly about wealth, that we really can get to an idea of what we could be promoting God-given generosity, no matter what stage of life, no matter how much money we have or not, even though we tend to focus only on the money thing in church. So in the ancient economy, some things that we have to get in mind, I just described my time of being a college student where I was what I would consider poor. But in the ancient world, it's not like there is a small class of impoverished people. 90% of the world would be considered poor. 90% of the world lived on day-to-day living, where what they earned that day, what they made that day, that was what they had to survive on. And so when the Bible talks about the poor people, when Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, his audience isn't thinking about some other group of people. He's talking to them. Versus often in the church today, particularly the evangelical church, we tend to be thinking about the them, about the other people, the poor people in our church, the poor people in our community. But we don't tend to be thinking about us. And I think it's really important for us to think about the primary audience of Scripture are the poor. That's the populace. That's everybody. Everybody's poor. Everybody is not well off. And so this blessing, blessed are the poor, is not Jesus' blessing for some other category. It's a way of blessing all people in their state of existence. But that also brings a challenge for us because that means that we're in a different economic position than people of Scripture. We have two different versions of that blessing. Matthew is going to say, blessed are the poor in spirit, and Luke's version is going to say, blessed are the poor. And so what we get there is that for Jesus, the physical poverty and the economic poverty, they're really not distinct. And we see that by the two versions of that. So for us, we tend to have, you don't have possessions, and so you're poor. And we tend to just physicalize that. So it's just without possessions. But the thing is when you are lacking your physical needs being provided, there's spiritual needs that are lacking as well. And so Jesus, as he's saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, he's saying, blessed are people who are physically poor, but he's also wanting to bless people because when you're physically poor, you have a greater dependence on other people and a greater dependence upon God. And Jesus is calling people to see that blessing. So you're not automatically a great person because you're poor. God's not privileging that way, but it's recognizing that when we're impoverished, there is a greater dependence. When I had to live on $10,000 a year, there was a lot of prayer involved in that kind of an experience. And thankfully for me, I had a good network of people that could help support me in that, and student loans that could help me with that, and those sorts of things, right? But this is a great question. So a different mindset when it comes to the poor. 90% of the world are poor. 10% of the world has most of the possessions, and really 1% of the world has everything. And it's like the difference between in today's economy would be between a poor person and people that are multimillionaires. There is no middle class. Doesn't exist. Also, when we look at the ancient economy, we discover in terms of social status, when we think about people like Jesus, he is a tradesman, he's an artisan. He grew up, his father was a carpenter or possibly a stone worker. That word is a little bit ambiguous when it comes to its translation, but he's an artisan. And artisans didn't have a stable income. It depended on what jobs were available for them. When we come to Paul was a tent maker who was able to travel out doing tent making skills. These are not people that are making a lot of money. But we have other people in the church. I have Erastus up there. Erastus was part of the wealthier class. He was an aedile in the city of Corinth. And we see in 1 Corinthians that there's an issue as the Christians gather together where you have, what do you do with some people who are getting there early and getting the best seats and getting the best food? You get other people that are in the worst seats getting the worst food. There's social class there that's involved, that people that have wealth and possessions, they're eating in the nice part of the home, separated away from everybody else, and the poor people are getting the leftovers, the remnants. And so the Christians in the early church were even struggling with what do you do with these differences between the rich and poor. And part of the uniqueness of Christianity is that the Christian community is bringing together the rich and poor alike. The ancient economy, it's an agricultural economy. So like I've already said, it's not really something that's based on going and getting a paycheck, getting jobs, certainly no credit cards in those days. It's all based on the harvest cycles, the cycles of when animals mate and when they have their offspring. And so it's just a different sort of economy than what we've experienced today. We still have remnants of this with things like the reason why we have long summer breaks for school is because that's a remnant back in the day when kids used to have to work on farms and when you had to get things ready during harvest time. I grew up on a farm, and so I remember almond harvest always happens in August, and you get out there and you work pretty hard in August. In California, it's like the hottest month of the year that you're out there getting nuts and collecting them and stuff. Another thing about money that we don't think about is that in the ancient world, in Jesus' time, money is political and religious. This may surprise us. If you look at our quarters and our dollars, they say things like, "In God we trust." We have a little bit of remnants that there's things like that. But in the ancient world, what you discover is that the early coins that had people's faces on them, the earliest inscriptions, if you look at the coin on your left, where you have a person's face in the front and an eagle on the back, that is the god Melech or Hercules on the front, and then an eagle on the back. And in the ancient world, the first images of people on coins were not people, they were gods and goddesses. And it was only with Alexander the Great that people began to be put on coins, real people and not the gods and goddesses. And so it was a statement of belief of the gods you worship. And what's interesting in Jesus' day is when you looked at the common coins that Rome produced, the denarius, the day's wage, which is the other coin that we have on here, that on that coin, you have an image of the emperor, and around the image, the inscription around that image, it says, "The divine Caesar," is one of the things that says. There's a claim of divinity by the Caesar. So not only do you have a face of the emperor like the old gods, making a claim that this Caesar is a god, but it actually says that he's a god. So when Jesus is asked about giving money to Caesar, he says, well, whose face and whose inscription? He's pointing out that whose face? Oh, do you see that idol's image on there? What inscription? Oh, you know the one that says he's the god. Oh, by the way, I had to borrow that denarius from you. I don't bring idolatrous coins into the temple, but thank you very much for bringing that idol into God's temple. And so there are religious overtones, religious statements that are made with money. It has weight to it that we don't even think about today. Money is stored in temples. They're the treasuries of the day. So there's a lot more religious aspects to money than we tend to think about. For us, we see it sacred and we see it secular. But in the ancient world, they saw that there was only sacred. And finally, the last one I have up here on ancient economy differences is that there's a patron-client system in the ancient world. So in our day, if I want to buy a house, which a number of years ago I was fortunate, I bought a house. And when I did that, my wife and I did that, we went to the bank, we got a loan, and we got my parents to co-sign the loan because it's the first time we were ever borrowing that much money and doing all that, and that big, scary, risky investment happens at the time. And that's how you go about getting loans. If you're going to go get a car, you might have to get an auto loan. You don't really think about it. Like, it's just the car dealership has the finance person so that you can afford that car that you would otherwise not be able to drive off the property with. And they know that you're going to pay it back, and there's things that'll happen to you if you don't. But for us, the lending system that we have in place, it's an exchange of material goods. In the ancient world, if you wanted to invest in something, you could find people that would loan you money, but the most common way to get ahead in life was to find someone who was wealthier than you, who would give you the money. Not loan you the money, give it to you. That person was called a patron. The reason they would give you that money is because they then expected you to be utterly loyal to them for the rest of your life. You owed them a debt. The more that you had something that you were given, the bigger the debt you had. A person might have multiple patrons, but the person that you owed the most amount of money to, that was the person you owed the most amount of loyalty to. And so there was a patron-client system. What's really interesting in the Bible is that a couple words that we use that are part of common Christian vernacular is we have this little word, you might not be familiar with it, but I think you are. It's called grace, right? I think you've heard of that, right? Grace. What's really interesting, in the patron-client system of the day, the gift that was given, the word that was used, there's a few different words used for gift, but one of the words for gift is grace. That's all that grace means. We fancy it up. But grace just means gift. patron would give their client a gift, a grace. And guess what? The expectation in return for that gift was a little something called faith or loyalty. It's another way. Pistis is the Greek word behind that. There is an exchange. Our words of faith and grace that we use, and we talk about the free gift of God through the grace of Christ, all that stuff is all wrapped up in the patron-client system. And that part of the message of the cross is that Jesus comes along and undoes these systems of loyalty, where there's a patron who gives such a gift that people are bound to that person for the rest of life, the strings attached to that gift, and that you were bound to that person, honor bound to that person for the rest of your life. God gives such an invaluable gift through the grace of Christ that his gift surpasses all other previous loyalties that we have, and we're expected to respond to that gift of grace through faith. So even the gospel has something a little countercultural, something to say a little bit about the way that economics work. So it's a little bit different system in the ancient world, ancient economy, than we have today. The Old Testament foundations. One of the things we need to understand when it comes to wealth and possessions is that God is the creator and owner of everything. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He made it all. And that's really important that we understand that we start as a foundation. So that he made this world, he made everything. So even the materials used to get my smartphone, we may have been able to fashion that stuff together, but we couldn't have even done that in the first place if God hadn't made this stuff in the first place. God made it all. We may fashion it, we may create things further, but it ultimately still comes down to what he made. And so the first thing we need to remember when it comes to stuff is we need to ground it in the story of creation. God's the creator. But I want to add to that, because people often say that. God made it all. God owns it all. But something that I don't hear emphasized enough with this idea is not only does God own it all, but when we look at the Old Testament story of the creation of the world, the story of creation begins with God declaring that his creation is good. And we don't tend to emphasize. We jump very quickly to the fall, to sin in the world. And we see sin in the world. But we need to understand that when God made the world, God's vision for the world, God's vision for life and possessions was a good life. And not only that, God made the world, but God enjoyed the world, right? Before the travesty of the fall, what does God do? He makes a garden, and he goes and hangs out with his creation on a regular basis. And I think we need to keep that in mind when it comes to wealth and possessions, that we need to remember that God's ideal is this ideal of the goodness of creation, and that God wants to enjoy his creation. He wants to enjoy people of creation. And that when we have wealth and possessions, that we need to be attuned. We need to be in line with that. We can see with the fall that people mess it up very quickly. But we can jump to the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, where we see that God restores this world with a new heavens and new earth. And you see images from the Garden of Eden reappearing at the end of Revelation. That God's plan, God's trajectory is that this world be restored and renewed. And that Christ's coming was the first act of that renewal of creation. And that one of the jobs of the church is to participate in that act of renewal. And one of the ways that we renew creation is when we let God's reign, God's rule in our lives, in our families' lives, our communities, and over our wealth and possessions. That we align our will. That doesn't mean we can't create the utopia of the end of Revelation. Right? A lot of other stuff has to happen. God's the one that renews creation. So we're not kidding ourselves that we're somehow making this world better and that we're making little mini kingdoms because we can do it right. We don't need God. I'm not saying that. But we can help people get a taste of what God is ultimately about to do. So wealth and possessions, there's a goodness that comes to this, and that we need to be trying to get at that God-honored goodness. The other thing we need to understand with God made it all is that humans are stewards of it all. So God made the world, made men and women, and he wanted people to be fruitful, to multiply, and to take care of his creation. So God's made us all. It's a good creation. And he's called us to be stewards in that creation. So really these three things, God's the creator and owner, people are stewards, and that there is a goodness to creation, but there's also a sinfulness that comes. And that what we need to do is we need to entrust our lives to Christ so that Christ can be renewing us, so that we focus on God-ordained goodness versus our natural tendency towards sin and misuse. We have in two ways when it comes to creation. We have one way of life. There's blessings with wealth and possessions, that we discover that wealth and possessions are a sign of our faithfulness to God, sign of God's blessings, that wealth and possessions can be a reward for our hard work, our hard labor. But we also discover that there's warnings that come with this. While there is certainly the benefits, the blessings, that we have to watch out, that wealth and possessions can lead to greed, that we want more. Once we have a taste of the good life, that's all we want is more of the good life. We discover that sometimes it leads to idolatry, that rather than worshiping God, we start worshiping our stuff. We also discover, and this I think is harder for us to see, is that there's a danger with wealth that has to do with injustice. That money and possessions are not always neutral. What do we do when we buy things or we benefit from things that we've gotten because other people have been exploited, right? So what do we do when we discover that, back in the days when Apple had its Foxconn controversies, where we discovered the conditions of laborers who are working for our phones aren't up to par? What do we discover when the chocolates we eat are being picked by slaves? What do we discover when we discover that people are being exploited for our benefit, so that we can get products that are good and cheap? What do we do when we can get cheap fast food, but the workers there don't have full-time work and don't have benefits, but we're able to? So there's an element of justice that comes. And one of the hard things, the tricky things, is that it's often when we have less money that we're more tempted towards the cheap things, isn't it? And so it's this very vicious cycle that gets built in. In some ways, we're part of the system. It's inescapable for us today, but we need to be aware of it. That's why we have social justice ministries. That's why we have in our churches emphasis on fighting human trafficking, promoting fair trade. Why our missionaries, these are things that are being raised up in our awareness, and why there's companies that are changing things. I still bought my iPhone back in the day, but there's things that we can do to be changing the system, and we need to recognize that. We need to be praying for it. We need to be working towards that. We also discover with possessions that you really can never have enough. There's always one more thing that we can have, and that it's a never-ending cycle. So while wealth and possessions, we can have blessings in our life, because we can see this as it's a sign of our faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to us. We can see it as a reward for hard work. We also need to be aware that there are things that can happen. There's traps that we need to avoid. The solutions to these traps and steering us towards the right are things like the principle of God owns it all. We also see Abraham's model, Abraham and his wealth, it's a gift. We see God blessing him roundly with land, with his family, and that ultimately he's meant to be a blessing to others. And while in some ways Abraham doesn't have these things completely fulfilled in his life, we can still see, particularly the blessings, we see how Abraham went around and blessed people who were on God's side and his side, and when they weren't on his side, that there was a curse that was involved. So Abraham's a great model in those terms. We see God, with the story of the Exodus, that God moves people from being slaves to their freedom. So that God is deeply concerned that people don't own people, that God owns everybody, that it's never right for one person to own another person. And I think that works both with literal slavery, which I think we're very aware of, but in some ways, employees who are not being treated well end up becoming slaves bound to the system where they can't get a better job. And while it is still vastly different from slavery, I don't want to minimize the reality of slavery, but there are aspects of that that come with low wages that we need to be aware of, and that God is always on the side of the oppressed. God calls people to take care, his people to take care of the poor, the aliens, the widows. He also encourages when you lend money, don't lend on interest. My parents lent money to my wife and I to buy our house, which we're very grateful for, but they lent it on interest. Still paying them back, but that's all right. It's interesting. That's one of them we tend to ignore that one nowadays. Remission of debts. So when you look at the sabbatical, every 7 years there's a Sabbath, and every 50 years there's a year of Jubilee where people and property restored. We also see God's solution comes with the tithe. Old Testament tithe, the principle, again, God owns it all, so give part back. We get models of the tithe, Abraham and Jacob giving a portion of tithe. In church, we'll talk about give your tithe, give your 10%. You might wonder where that number comes from. The word tithe literally just means 10% of your stuff. So when you say tithe, you're saying give your 10%. People don't know what tithe means, so we tend to say give your tithe, which is 10%, which is, we're actually being redundant, but that's okay. Tithe is give 10% of your stuff, and it's not just your money, because they don't have a lot of money, it's just their stuff. Give 10% of your harvest, give 10% of your flocks, give 10% of what you've produced as an artisan. Whatever your stuff is for that year, give 10% of your stuff. In addition to that, we discovered that God asked his people to give the first fruits of things. So the first thing you give, whether it's your kids or whether it's a harvest of grain, wine, oil, animals like herds and flocks, whatever it is, you need to be giving the first fruits of those things. Now for kids, you don't give your firstborn kid to God. He takes substitutions for that firstborn so that we're not giving all of our kids over to God. But God expects the first thing to be given to him. The best things. It's the risk, right? If you have one, how do you know that you're going to have future ones? So animals, if you don't want to give your firstborn animal, you can redeem that at 120% of the price. Your kids get redeemed by a half shekel. And if it's too far to pay with the physical stuff, you can always turn it into cash and send it into the treasury system. So God had this expectation of 10% of stuff being given and the first things of stuff being given. But again, it's stuff. It's broader than that. Then we tend to think about just our paycheck. And it was done as a system to remind us that God owns it all. And I don't think that stuff is necessarily too new and profound. But one thing that's interesting when it comes to the church, as a church, we use this, we say, give 10% to your church, maybe some of that goes to missions. What's really interesting is in the tithe cycle, there's a 7-year cycle, and the first 2 years, you give it to the main temple, where the Levite gets it. But also what happens is actually the person who goes, if they're doing a sacrifice, you share it with the priest. It's not just for the temple. There's supposed to be a communal aspect of it, that the person giving actually benefits from that gift as well. It's a two-way street. But every 3rd year, it doesn't go off to Jerusalem's central temple. Every 3rd year, it stays local. And it helps the local Levite who lives in your town, but also it helps it targets specifically the poor and the immigrants. There it says aliens, but more modern term, right? The immigrant, foreign immigrants, the people who are not citizens, those people who do not belong, those people who do not. And so the 10% tithe, twice out of the 7-year cycle, is specifically targeted for the poor and immigrants. I think this is where churches that are starting to give 10% of the resources to the community, where we're starting to divest some of our tithes to people outside of our own church. I think this is very much in line with what the Old Testament tithe looks like. If we're going to take the principles of tithe, we can't simply say, give 10% of your money to the church, because the church is somehow the Levites. We have to look at how the Old Testament tithe was used and discover that it was used far more roundly than just, we need to make sure that we have a good evangelistic mission, we need a good discipleship, we need to make sure our worship lives. Those are all important things, but it's not enough. And that there's a challenge when it comes for the church, that we need to be using more of our tithes and resources, not just for the church, but for the local community. And that we need to be using more of our resources specifically for the poor and the aliens in our midst, if we're going to follow Old Testament models. I wish that we were still under the Old Testament tithe. I've just talked about that. That's how we make. But dadgummit, the New Testament never talks about a tithe. Paul says things like, we're not under law, but under grace. Yes, thank you, Paul. I don't have to give away any money. It's all mine. Stuff's mine. Darn Jesus. When he asked about it, he says, give it all away. Like, there's people that need stuff. You give them the stuff. Jesus is uncompromising on this. Jesus has very much, if there's a rich person and a poor person in his midst, he's always going to tell the rich guy or gal, give your stuff to the poor. It's always about the poor. In the New Testament, sometimes we associate the Levites and that tithe with the Christian priests or pastors. Origen, as an early Christian commentator, made that connection. Another early Christian named Augustine says that the tithe is the minimum standard for Christians, the 10%. I think Augustine's probably more on track for us of striking that balance between Jesus. Give it all away to let's not be people that are so legalistic with the 10%. If you're like me, or you have people like me in your church, I was raised to give 10%. I told you I did farm work as a kid. Grandpa, we would rake rows of almond trees. We call them almond trees, though, because I'm from the country. So everyone never knows what I say when I said almond, so I've been trained to say almond. But when we would rake those trees back in the day, we got, I think it was 25 cents a row to clear almonds off the trees. And in the midst of that, we would, Grandpa, at the end of the day, we would collect as a Grandpa made sure that we paid our taxes on that and that we paid our tithe on that. So as a, I don't know, like 10-year-old, I was paying taxes. But Grandpa, my parents taught that early on, like those are just instilled values. So it didn't matter, like for me, whether I'm making 25 cents a row or what I'm making now, it's always been it's part of my DNA to give 10%. In my church, we have automatic giving that happens, auto pay. It's how I don't even, which is great, because I always would forget the checkbook or all that at church. It's great. I just show up to church and I know it's already been taken care of. I don't even think about my tithe anymore. But in some ways, I think that's a problem. And whenever I teach this class, I get challenged that as much as I do really good at the 10%, I'm not sure it's enough. Certainly, Augustine says it's a minimum. And certainly, if you go look to Jesus, he's constantly encouraging us to give more away, to never be settled with accumulating our possessions, but to be using our possessions for the kingdom of God. And I think that I challenge each and every one of us that we not just challenge our churches to stick with the 10%, but we challenge people that that's just the starting point for us. And that we really are called, there's a blessing that happens if we give more. I think over and over you see the Bible, it starts with giving ourselves, and when we give ourselves, our stuff comes with us. But what we do, we're so material, we give our stuff, and maybe we go along. Right? And even when we give our 10% of our stuff, we're giving God his due, but we keep ourselves. In the New Testament, we see very similar beginnings, foundations, is what we see in the Old Testament. God is a creator. He cares. So Jesus is going to give parables like, look at the ravens and the lilies in the field. God cares about them. They come and go. If he cares about fleeting things like lilies in the field, if he cares about fleeting things like birds, he certainly cares about us. And in the response, when we recognize that God cares for us, is not to worry about our lives, to not get so caught up with the day-to-day, but to seek God's kingdom. And then this is Luke's version of sell it all, because God's treasure is in our heart. That getting to this foundational principle that God owns it all, God owns us, and God gives it. And partly, I think when it comes to giving it all, when Jesus calls us to give everything away, again, and in my mind, as soon as I hear that, I think I've got to go empty my checking account and go down to the church and hand it over to my pastor. I need to sell my car, because we're in such a monetary thing with the 10%. That's what it means to give it all. But I don't think that's what Jesus means when he gives it all. It's really probably a better way to say it is use it all for the kingdom of God, right? So when you open your house up to your neighbors and you invite them in because you're trying to reach your neighborhood for the community of God, when you offer ride-sharing services, bringing kids to church or taking kids to school who are in need, when you're using your possessions for God's kingdom, then you are seeking the kingdom of God, and you're using your stuff for God. And that we really need to get out of this 10% of our finances mindset into this possessions mindset, and that we need to be giving our stuff, using our stuff for God. So my computer, my phone, I'm not going to sell them and give them away and to further the kingdom of God. What do? I use my phone. This is part of how I contact you guys sometimes, right? I do Canvas, and I use my computer. I write books. I'm using these things for the kingdom of God. If I sold them, I couldn't do that anymore. So the possessions you have were given to you by God, so use them for God's kingdom. Doesn't mean give them away in the way that you don't have them, but it's use. You might find you're called to give away certain things, but some things you keep because you're furthering the kingdom. We need to remember principles as well, that there's a dependence. Blessed are the poor. We talked about this already, that when you're poor, physically poor, when you don't have enough stuff, you're dependent upon others and you're dependent upon God. It's amazing when we're in moments of want, how often that drives us to prayer, how it drives us to the church. So I think about in my own life, we don't have family that live in Southern California. And my wife and I have 4 kids. We work full-time, both of us. And so sometimes like getting to school, getting to work, like some of that depends on people in my church volunteer. They babysit my kids. We've got an adopted grandma, the executive pastor of our church. His wife takes care of my kids twice a week, picks them up from school twice a week, because I could not afford to pay a sitter or childcare for that on a regular basis. And so even in the midst of having a full-time job, there are ways that we find ourselves feeling in want and need, and the church and being dependent upon God and dependent on the church. And it's a blessing when that happens. And I think as pastors, sometimes modeling that for people, we really don't have to have all the answers. It's better for our church if our church has opportunities to minister to us as well. It's not our job always to be ministering to people. There's a ministry that happens when you receive gifts from the church as well. Jesus also said, if you have a need, just ask. So our Father art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Right? Give us our daily bread. That's basically just give us what we need for the day. We're stewards of our what we're given. We can think of our gifts and talents. And then I've already talked about the give to Caesar what Caesar's give to God, God's with the denarius. People came to Jesus asking what they should do with this coin, and we often interpret this as give your tax and give your tithe and give your taxes, right? So give to Caesar what Caesar's, that's your taxes, give to God what's God's, your tithe. But that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus identifies this as an idolatrous coin with the emperor on it. The mark is seal is there so that you know that this is Caesar's coin, and Caesar is an idol, a false god. So give back Caesar his money. He can have it. But you know what? You need to give God what's God's. And what Jesus does there is by pointing out the image of the Caesar on the coin, there's an echo of the creation story there, that we are all created in the image of God. While Caesar has his mark of ownership on this coin, God has his mark of ownership on every human because we've been created in the image of God. And I think that passage is really saying, give Caesar back his money, it's fine. But you owe God your whole life, your whole self. Give God you. If you give back to God yourself, well, your stuff is going to come. What could be 10% of your paycheck? It might be more, it might be less. But Jesus is really centered not on the money, but on you and I. And I think, again, with this money, wealth, and possessions, we've made it too narrow by focusing on our paycheck. And overall, what we see is God owns it all, including us. He wants us. And if we begin by giving ourselves back, the 10% of our paycheck or whatever that looks like is going to be much bigger, more complete. There's 2 ways with money. There's greedy problems. We love wealth. There's bad wealth in the New Testament as well. The word for that is mammon. So it's the love of money and love of wealth is the root of all evil. So don't love your possessions. Don't love your wealth. And partly it's we have to be aware that wealth can be got by unjust means, exploitation. We see the story of the rich fool who builds bigger barns and God kills him in the night because he just keeps hoarding his stuff instead of using his stuff as a blessing. How often do we love our possessions? How often do we hoard our stuff and just want to get more? That's part of the American dream. That's part of our DNA. Again, what we're discovering now in our global economy is how much of the stuff that we have has been achieved by unjust means that we're not even aware of. That greed creates problems, disparity. But there's generous solutions. So we see when we encounter Jesus, when he sees the rich young man, he tells him to sell it all, but depend on God. So we may not be called to sell all of our stuff, but I think we're called at least to be giving ourselves entirely to God ourselves, and whatever amount of our possessions goes with that will follow. He says, don't just invite your friends to meals, but invite people that are in need. Right? Do we, in our community gatherings, are we always just gathering with the people we know? Are we asking coworkers? Are we asking neighbors over our house? Are we inviting them into our inner homes, our inner sanctuaries, so that they can get to know us, and then they can get to know God? What about forgiving loans? So what kind of debts do other people owe us? Are the things that we could be doing so that we're not holding things over us? Can the church be a place of generosity for people? Part of this as well, as we give away, it reminds us that God owns it all. When we give it away, we start to trust God with that little bit of our life. When you give away 10% of your possessions, you're trusting God with at least 10% of your life. The more you give away, the larger percentage of your life that you're entrusting to God. It's an opportunity for us. It speaks against, I've talked about already, that generosity is a challenge to give it all, but I think there's also an opportunity for us when we think about the difference between our pursuit of acquiring things, that's our goal, get more stuff, versus an attitude of sacrifice, of giving away for others. We are so self-centered, so greedy in what we want for ourselves, that we always put ourselves first, maybe our family first. But part of the call to sacrifice is to begin to put others first, to have a different mindset, to be countercultural. The dishonest manager is an interesting story in Luke. There's this weird parable in Luke chapter 16 where there's this manager who's working for his boss. Boss discovers he's been dishonest, he's been ripping him off, so he fires him. On the way out the door, the manager goes up to people who owe his boss money, and he settles their debts. Says, don't worry about it, you don't owe my boss anything anymore. You're free and clear. Now, the weird thing about that story is that that's not what that boss should have done. The boss would have heard that and fired him. But at the end, the boss hears what this guy does and says, good job. He doesn't rehire him, but he says, that was very impressive. Good job. Way to go. Pats him on the back on the way out. I feel like if I worked at Starbucks and was a terrible employee, I get fired. So as I'm going out the door, I start grabbing coffee beans and all the expensive coffee mugs and as much really expensive Starbucks paraphernalia as possible. I gave them away to all the customers on my way out. Store clearance. My name's Toney. Hire me in the future. See what a great guy I am. And the managers, rather than calling the police, said, good job. Oh, that's impressive. It's a weird parable. We don't understand why Jesus would commend this guy as someone who would be a model. How could God be like a boss who doesn't really seem to recognize bad employees? How are Christians supposed to be like this dishonest manager? The thing doesn't make any sense. And pastors will do all sorts of things to make that parable make sense. They'll say things like that the owner was charging interest which he wasn't supposed to, and so that's what gets cut off. They come up with excuses for why this stuff works. I don't think that's what, if Jesus wanted us to think that was what was going on, he would have included that in the parable. They're not part of the keys to the parable. Instead, the parable, it's as straightforward, like it is a dishonest manager. The guy doesn't do a good job. He gets fired for it. He gets praised for it. Like, that is it. The point is, Jesus is making a comparison that in this world, in this life, like, if your pursuit of money, wealth, and possessions is your central interest, you will do whatever it takes along that path. You know what your objectives are, and you use your money, wealth, and possessions to achieve a comfortable life. And Jesus is saying, this guy back in those days, that's what his goal was, have a comfortable life. He knew what his goals were, and he was using possessions in order to achieve those goals. He says, people of God, we know where stuff really comes from. It comes from God. It's a gift from God. We've been told the proper use of possessions is to take care of other people. We know what stuff is really about, and we know what stuff is really for. If people of this world have their own sense of objectives, they're clear on their visions and goals, and they know what to do, how much better should the people of God who really know where stuff comes from manage and use possessions? We need to be a better example to the world about what money, wealth, and possessions are used for. And so you get, that strange parable with that side. So for us, we use money for helping the poor, helping the widows. We certainly need to be helping our ministers, but we also need to be thinking about how we can use things locally. In the early church, they sold other possessions, helped each other out. But we also see with the Jerusalem collection that churches weren't just concerned about their immediate needs, but they were concerned about the church worldwide. We need to have attention not just for our local church, but for the global church. We need to have concern not just with ministers, but also with the poor and widows in our midst. We also discover, lastly, that there's this interesting challenge to us, what we call Jubilee economics, that we need to be careful with our investments. We need to avoid, I think, dishonest wealth and investments. We probably need to be a little bit more attentive to our portfolios, of what we're investing in. We need to be people that are willing not just to make people pay for debts, but that we can be people who are forgiving debts. So we can help people with getting out of debt. That's, I think, where things like Ramsey's goals of at least helping. You're not going to get banks to just suddenly forgive you your money, but to help people get out of debt is a way that we can help with this. We can be helping by taking care of the poor, aliens, and widows. So we can be treating people like family. What's really interesting here with Luke chapter 4, this Jubilee economics, Luke's gospel, this is the first sermon that Jesus gives. It's the beginning of his public ministry. Jesus is in his hometown. He picks up a scroll. He reads from Isaiah that says, I've come to preach good news to the poor and oppressed, the widows. This is how Jesus begins his ministry. He said, this is what the gospel is all about. And when he gets to saying that it's for not just Jewish people, his own people, but for the Gentiles, his own town gets mad at him and tries to kill him, tries to throw him off a cliff. This is controversial stuff. This is countercultural stuff. So much so that we really don't focus on this aspect of Jesus' gospel ministry. This is the opening sermon of Jesus, saying, I have come as the Messiah to relieve people of their economic hardships, that's part of God's concerns, that my people are supposed to be part of this, and that I'm here to take care of the other. And the church seems to be looking different at these kind of things. But we tend to spiritualize only our gospel. We tend to spiritualize our gift giving. We tend to reduce our gift giving even just down to the physicality of our paychecks. And Jesus wants to challenge us to think more broadly about our wealth and possessions, to participate in his messianic ministry of taking care of the poor and widows.